All right, the next part that we're going to talk about is imaginary and complex numbers. So an imaginary number is represented as an I, and we get an imaginary number by taking the square root of a negative number. So we can't do that because remember, if we're taking a square root of something, we're trying to find something times itself, but I can't take two negative numbers and multiply them together to get a negative. So two negatives times each other gives us a positive. So to help us simplify radicals further when we have a negative in there, our mathematicians made up a nice little letter to represent that. So again, if we are taking the square root of a negative, we're going to represent it as an I on the outside of the radical. So that also means if I have I squared, so if I'm taking I times I, that will simplify to be a negative 1. I cubed, so I times I, will give us negative I. And I to the 4th will give us 1. And then our pattern starts over. So now we're going to go back and practice simplifying radicals, but this time if there's a negative, we also need to take an I out of the radical. So for 12, we already know that positive 12 can be simplified, so I'm really going to think of this as the square root of negative 1 times 12, and then continue to simplify. So 12 we can write as 4 times 3, so and again that negative 1 is just going to be in front. So the square root of 4 is 2, so 2 is going to come out of the radical. The square root of negative 1 is I, and then we still have 3 inside the radical. So this would be my simplified answer. So the next one, looking at it, I can think of this as negative 1 times 7. Well, I know there's not a perfect square that divides into 7, so the only thing that we can do to simplify is to take the square root of negative 1, which is I, so that comes out of the radical, and then 7 stays inside. So this is our simplified answer. So our next one, again, we're going to think of this as negative 1 times 24, and we can find a perfect square that divides into 24, so we can use 4 times 6. So negative 1 times 4 times 6. So 4 can come out as 2, negative 1 comes out as I, and 6 will have to stay inside the radical. And when you write this, it's always the number, and then I, and then the radical. So it does need to be in that order. We never want to put I in front of the number, only in front of a radical. Now we also have something called the complex number. And this is an imaginary and a real number that is being added or subtracted together. So this is the general form where we have a plus bi. An actual example would be something like 2 plus 3i. Or we could have negative 5 plus 3i. Or even 2 minus 4i. Or negative 2 minus 7i. So those are all examples of a complex number. So the part with I, this is called the imaginary part, and then the number without I, this is called the real part. Okay, so a complex number is made up of a real and an imaginary number. An imaginary number is only with the I, so we don't have a real number included with it. That's being added or subtracted. So this added subtracted part is really important when we're thinking about a complex number. Now you're probably wondering how our imaginary and complex numbers all fit together in our list of numbers. So if you remember at the very beginning of the year we did this nice little diagram and we're going to add to it. So before we didn't have this imaginary part or even this complex part, we just had the real numbers and then all of its subgroups. So now we're adding something, so our imaginary numbers. And then our real numbers plus our imaginary numbers make up the complex numbers. So all of these numbers are underneath complex numbers. So we're adding a couple number sets to our knowledge. Here's another representation if this is a little bit easier for you to understand. So again, our big set of numbers is our complex ones. And then we have underneath it the real numbers and imaginary numbers. And then imaginary numbers doesn't have anything else. Real numbers are made up of rational and irrational. Our rational numbers are made up of our fractions and integers. Okay? And then our integers is what we care about further. So those are the positive and negative whole numbers and 0. And then our whole numbers are made up of 0 and our natural numbers. So natural numbers is our smallest subgroup. Okay? So again, here's the other one that we looked at the very beginning of the year. So we just added those two categories to it.